Washington imposed 50% tariffs to crush Canada's steel industry. Instead, Ottawa just declared economic independence. The pivot nobody saw coming.
American pressure didn't force surrender. It triggered transformation. Canada chose sovereignty over negotiation, and Washington's leverage just collapsed.
Breaking tonight, Canada's industrial strategy just transformed completely. Mark Carney didn't negotiate, he pivoted. Tensions are escalating across North American trade tonight. Washington imposed punitive tariffs expecting Canadian capitulation, but instead of economic surrender, Ottawa accelerated domestic transformation. Everyone believed Canada's steel and aluminum producers would collapse under American pressure. Financial markets expected Ottawa to beg for tariff relief within weeks. Analysts assumed Carney would eventually cave to Trump's demands and accept whatever terms Washington offered. They were all utterly incorrect. Ottawa, November 25th, 2025. Standing before Canadian media, Prime Minister Mark Carney prepares to make an announcement that will reshape this country's industrial landscape. If trade security is threatened, Canada will not retreat. We will build our own capacity starting immediately. Translation: Ottawa just told Washington that Canadian economic sovereignty is non-negotiable. And what happened next? The country that invested in domestic steel and aluminum infrastructure reveals exactly why Canadian self-reliance is reshaping North American trade while American leverage collapses. Dear viewers, between March and November 2025, something extraordinary happened in Canadian industrial policy. Washington pushed too hard, Ottawa said no, and Canadian producers, patient and professional, became the priority every government minister started focusing on first. This isn't just about one failed tariff strategy. This is about the fundamental collapse of economic coercion as a tactic and the rise of domestic sovereignty as the new currency of industrial power. Let me take you back to where this really started. March 2025. Donald Trump, frustrated by Canadian trade policies, makes a move that shocks Ottawa. 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum effective immediately. The American president's calculation was simple: crush Canadian producers with tariffs, force Ottawa to accept American terms, maintain Washington's dominance in North American trade relationships. Wall Street loved it. Financial analysts predicted Canadian capitulation within 60 days. The narrative was set. Canada needs America more than America needs Canada. Carney would have no choice but to negotiate from weakness. But something unexpected happened. Canadian producers didn't collapse. They adapted. They found new markets. They lobbied Ottawa for support. And Mark Carney, watching this economic aggression unfold, started making calculations of his own. Then June arrived. Trump, apparently unsatisfied with the damage from 25% tariffs, doubled down, 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. The highest rates in modern North American trade history. Let that sink in. 50%. Washington essentially tried to price Canadian industrial products out of existence. The message was clear. Accept American terms or watch your industries die. But here's what Trump miscalculated. Every time Washington escalated, every time another punitive tariff landed on Canadian producers, something else happened in Ottawa. Carney's resolve strengthened. His commitment to Canadian economic independence deepened. His determination to build domestic capacity intensified, and then came the Ontario ad incident. The moment everything changed. Ontario's government, frustrated with American tariff aggression, created an advertisement for American audiences. The message? Trade wars hurt everyone. And to make that point, they used Ronald Reagan's own words about the importance of free trade between neighbors. Reagan, the conservative icon, speaking against protectionism, delivered to American voters through Canadian-funded advertising. Trump's reaction was volcanic. He didn't just criticize the ad. He didn't just complain to Carney. He did something unprecedented. He called off all trade talks with Canada completely. No negotiation, no discussion, no path forward. The reason? He was offended that Canada used Reagan's words against his tariff policy. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States ended trade negotiations with America's second largest trading partner because he was upset about a television advertisement quoting a former Republican president. Carney, according to reports, apologized for the ad, a diplomatic gesture meant to restart conversations. But Washington's response? Silence. No revival of talks, no reopening of channels, nothing. And that's when something clicked in Ottawa. That's when the calculation changed completely. If apologies don't work, if diplomacy fails, if Washington refuses even basic negotiation, then what's left? One option. Build Canadian capacity. strengthen domestic production, create independence from American markets. Which brings us to today, November 25th, 2025, Carney's announcement. The details are significant. Ottawa will now limit imports of foreign steel from countries that don't have trade agreements with Canada. Simple policy, profound implications. Translation: if you're not a trade partner, you're not accessing Canadian markets. And if you're imposing 50% tariffs on Canadian products, you're definitely not a reliable trade partner. The numbers tell the story. This policy shift opens up $854 million in additional market potential for Canadian steel producers. That's not a small adjustment. That's a fundamental restructuring of domestic market access. But Carney I didn't stop there. Ottawa is also implementing measures to transform the steel industry itself, making Canadian producers more competitive in domestic markets. How? By cutting interprovincial steel transport costs by 50%. Let me explain why that matters. Right now, moving steel from Quebec to Alberta costs Canadian companies significantly more than similar distances in integrated American markets. That transportation cost disadvantage makes domestic steel less competitive even in Canadian projects. Carney's plan eliminates that handicap. 50% reduction in interprovincial transport costs means Canadian steel becomes dramatically more competitive in Canadian construction, Canadian infrastructure, Canadian manufacturing. Washington imposed tariffs to hurt Canadian producers. Ottawa responded by making those same producers more competitive at home. There's more. Aid programs for workers and businesses in the steel and lumber sectors. Not just corporate support, worker protection, skills training, transition assistance, the full package of industrial policy support. This is comprehensive economic strategy, not reactive crisis management. And here's what makes this particularly effective. Trump's tariffs were supposed to force Canadian dependence on American markets. Instead, they triggered Canadian investment in domestic independence. Every dollar Ottawa commits to steel industry transformation is a dollar reducing Canada's vulnerability to Washington's trade tantrums. Every percentage point reduction in transport costs makes Canadian producers less dependent on export markets Trump can weaponize. The pattern is remarkable. Washington tries economic coercion, Ottawa builds economic sovereignty. American leverage decreases, Canadian independence increases. Think about the broader implications. Canadian steel producers now have guaranteed domestic market access, lower transportation costs, and government support programs. American producers have a president who randomly imposes tariffs on allies and abruptly cancels trade negotiations over television advertisements. Which industrial environment would you rather operate in? Which government would you rather depend on for stable trade policy? The answer is becoming obvious to manufacturers across North America. And that realization is exactly what's reshaping continental trade dynamics. But let's be clear about what this announcement represents at its core. This isn't just about steel and aluminum. This is about Canada choosing a different path. A path that doesn't depend on American stability. A path that doesn't require Washington's approval. A path built on domestic capacity and international diversification. Trump thought tariffs would bring Carney to heel. Instead, they pushed Ottawa toward independence. Washington thought economic pressure would force Canadian compliance. Instead, it triggered Canadian transformation. And now, here we are, 8 months after the first tariffs, 3 months since trade talks collapsed. And Canada is announcing the exact opposite of what Trump expected. Not surrender. Sovereignty. The timing tells you everything you need to know about Carney's strategic patience. He could have responded immediately to the March tariffs with emergency measures. He could have panicked after the June escalation with desperate negotiations. He could have rushed into concessions after the trade talk collapse. Instead, he waited, planned, built consensus, developed comprehensive policy, and when he finally moved, he moved decisively. That's not weakness, that's strategic discipline, and it's exactly that discipline that's making Washington increasingly nervous. Because Trump's entire approach to Canada was based on an assumption. The assumption that Canada needed America more than America needed Canada. The assumption that economic pressure would force political submission. But what happens when that assumption proves false? What happens when the country you're trying to coerce starts building alternatives to your markets? What happens when your tariffs don't create dependence? They create independence? You lose leverage. Permanently. That's what's happening right now in North American trade. America is losing the leverage it thought was permanent. Canada is gaining the independence Washington thought was impossible. $854 million in new market potential for Canadian steel, 50% reduction in interprovincial transport costs, comprehensive worker and business support programs. These aren't minor adjustments. This is industrial transformation. And it's happening because Trump fundamentally misunderstood what drives Canadian policy. He thought it was fear of American economic power. He was wrong. It's commitment to Canadian sovereignty. So, as you watch this story develop, as you see the steel and aluminum measures announced, as you hear Washington's inevitable complaints, remember what this is really about. This is about a country that refused to be intimidated, a prime minister who chose strategy over panic, an industrial sector that adapted instead of surrendering, and a future where Canadian economic policy is made in Ottawa, not dictated from Washington. Trump imposed tariffs to prove American dominance. Carney responded with policies that build Canadian independence. The question isn't whether Canada can survive without American approval anymore. The question is whether America can maintain its influence when countries stop asking for that approval. And based on what we're seeing tonight, the answer is becoming increasingly clear. Breaking tonight, Canada's industrial strategy just transformed completely. Mark Carney didn't negotiate, he pivoted. And what comes next will determine whether North American trade relationships are built on coercion or cooperation. One thing is certain. Ottawa just made its choice. Look, everything I've shown you tonight comes from public data and official reporting. But the conclusions, those are mine. You decide what it means. If you're watching this because you believe Canada's future doesn't have to depend on Washington's approval, if you're tired of analysis that assumes Canadian weakness, if you want coverage that treats sovereignty as strength rather than fantasy, then you're in the right place. Canada Next covers these developments every single day. The transformation's happening right now. The partnerships being built while traditional alliances fracture. The moment Canada stopped asking for permission and started building alternatives. This is the story they're not telling you on traditional news. And it's the story that matters most right now.